Okay, guys, so today I'm going to be reading a Cruel Prince short story called A Visit to the Impossible Lands. I found it at the back of my Cruel Prince copybook, and I've just been rereading it, and I found it back there, so now I want to read it for everyone else because I never hear anybody talk about it, and it has some great Cardan scenes in it, and I just find it intriguing. So, yeah, we're going to read that today. So the story is called A Visit to the Impossible Lands, and it's from a point of view of one of the extremely minor characters, to be honest with you. But yeah, so here we go. Kai Thierch perched on the fire escape outside her building, espresso in her hand, breathing the iron-tinged summer scents of the city, garbage and smoke, cooking meat, the river, fresh poured asphalt, and rot. It was well after 3 in the morning, and one of her favorite times to watch over the streets below, to see friends staggering home, arms thrown about one another. To see business people stumble, wondering how it got so late. To see the traffic of excess, people wringing a few more giddy moments from a day, eager to do something memorable, whether they'd want to remember it or not, before the sun came up. Part of her was tempted to take off her shirt and glide around the sky on the delicate moth's wings folded tight against her back, to follow the twinkling lights of the cars below, streaming over bridges and through the grid of roads, to soar over the river. Another part of her wanted a second espresso. "I didn't see you there at first. I thought you might not come home," came a voice from behind her, a trace of the otherworldly in his accent. Lord Räuben, king of the court of termites, her boyfriend, or maybe something more than that since she'd completed a quest and been made his official consort. A relationship stage entirely outside the quizzes in Cosmo magazine. She turned to grin at him. He was wearing a worn black t-shirt, making his white hair and silvery eyes look starker by the contrast. He'd recently cut his hair. It used to fall over his shoulders in a shining pool, but now it was choppy and barely long enough to hang in his eyes. He reached out his fingers, and she took them, letting him help her climb over the windowsill as though she were a great lady atop a horse instead of a metal stair. "You look tired." She slid back her apartment and went to put the coffee cup in the sink. "Tired of being too long from your side," he said, which made her snort in a sheer incredulity. He gave her a smile in return. She knew he liked that she didn't take him too seriously when everyone else in his life treated him with vast deference. They'd always lived apart. Kay had started a coffee shop with her friends called Moon in a Cup, which had evolved to sell more and more magical pastries and potions. Now there was a secret menu of gillyflower scones and espressos cut with tears, and all the magical folk of New York stopped by to have meetings or breakfast or assignations. Meanwhile, Räuben had been ruling over 2 fractious courts merged into one highly unstable court of termites, named for the sprawling unseelie palace built beneath a graveyard on a hill. Räuben insisted that it pleased him that Kay didn't have to deal with the raw fury of the unseelie court and the delicate machinations of the seelie court that he loved having an escape. Her apartment, her life, her arms. But over the years, watching the exhausted way he slept on a simple mattress in a messy apartment, hearing the surprised pleasure of his laughter, feeling the desperate hunger of his kisses, she'd become more and more afraid that he wasn't telling her the whole truth. He'd been given to the last unseelie queen to be her knight, forced to do her bidding no matter how terrible, forced to endure whatever cruelties she could devise. Kay wondered how that he developed low standards for happiness. "So," she asked, "how long have I got you this time?" Räuben was skilled at keeping his own counsel, but she read something in the twitch of his lip and the set of his jaw. She raised a single eyebrow. "I wish for you to come with me on a journey," he said, spreading his hands in acknowledgement of being caught out. there is to be a great coronation, the passing of the crown of the High King of Elfheim to his son, and I want you to accompany me. I can promise that we will dance and drink, and that there will be time for very little else but merriment, and there is no one I would rather be merry with." She frowned at him. Despite those flattering words, a week before they talked about going to a lake somewhere, with a little tree house away from everything, with only fireflies to rule over. Instead, they were going to the high court for what was bound to be bullshit. "There will be dozens of lords and ladies," he said, "and we, lost among them, wholly unremarkable and entirely forgotten. Elfheim is 3 islands with sea all around, where mermaids come to sun themselves on the black rocks. I am told it's beautiful." "And you're really going to swear fealty to this new guy?" she asked, dubious about Reuben's ability to be unremarkable anywhere. "I have promised Prince Dane that I would come and consider it, but yes, most alike. A high monarch would give me an excuse to curb the unseelie court's appetites without being seen to prefer the seelie ways." Reuben touched her hair lightly in that odd way he had, as though he half expected his fingers to pass through her, as though she might be made of glamour and smoke and his own hopeless longings. "And because it is wearying to always be at war." "Very well," she said. "I'll go to your thing. You promise we're going to have fun?" How could it be otherwise, he asked, which ought to have been her first warning. This was how she wound up at the high court in Elfheim, dressed in a silky slip, combat boots, and a lot of eyeliner. Standing near Dulcamara, she couldn't help noticing the nervous looks courtiers kept throwing in Reuben's direction, and the wide berth their whole party was getting. Reuben himself was in serious conference with the new Elder King, and seemed to be politely pretending not to notice how many of the folk were terrified of him. "Wholly unremarkable, my ass," she thought. "What's their problem?" Kay asked Dulcamara, glaring at a troll until he turned his gaze somewhere else. Dulcamara shrugged. Her red hair was braided into an elaborate and somehow menacing knot on top of her head, her black armor polished to a shine. Kay, in deference to the fanciness of this occasion, had put a sparkly green clip in her hair to match the color of her skin, but she was feeling that maybe she should have dressed up a lot more. "Lord Reuben makes a menacing figure," Dulcamara said finally, when it became clear that Kai was waiting for some kind of response, "and one with a reputation for popping off the heads of monarchs." Kay couldn't actually argue with that. "Which one is Prince Dane?" she asked. Dulcamara frowned in concentration. "Not here yet. The princesses are... That's Elowin, Celia? Celia? I don't know. Raya. And beside them is the eldest prince, Belkin." "Eldest, but not inheriting?" Kay asked. "The High King passed over his 2 eldest and chose the 3rd. To sire 6 children is unusual in Fairy," Dulcamara said. "Most folk are lucky if in 100 years they beget a single child. 2 is considered a great blessing. 6 is a vulgar fortune." "You only named 5, Kay asked. Dulcamara gestured toward the crowd. "The 6th is there, the youngest prince, Cardan, dancing with that mortal girl." Kai's eyebrows went up. She'd met the only other mortal she'd noticed. A nervous-looking redhead who'd come along with the new Alder King. He'd been a little startled by the contrast between Kay's green skin, ink-drop eyes, and the mortal way of speaking, but had quickly decided she might know the answers to some of his questions about the reels that were being played. Despite her own mother being in a band for pretty much ever, Kay hadn't, and the boy had wandered off to find someone who did. This mortal was a girl dressed in gloves and a long gown that appeared like the sky at night. She was of medium height, with hair the red-brown of a willow tree. She had soft features and a solid grace of someone used to living in her body. An acrobat, perhaps, or a soldier. The tall fairy boy who held her in his arms had a mess of black hair. His cheeks were painted in silver, his eyes edged in black coal, and he looked drunk, his crown askew. The girl was glaring at him, and Kay wondered how they wound up dancing together. Then she noticed the way he was looking at her, but that made things even more puzzling. "Who's the girl?" Kay asked. "The general has 2 human wards," Dulcamara returned. "That's one of them. They're twins, but I can't tell them apart." like Witterkin's changelings, Kay said. She'd been a changeling herself, dropped into the mortal world with a lot of warding, not even discovering she was a pixie until she was a teenager. What would it be like to be a human who didn't understand human stuff, the way she still wasn't sure she understood fairy? Maybe if she'd grown up in this world, parties like this coronation would make more sense to her. She looked over at Reuben and he caught her eye, his smile easy. If she walked over to him, he would draw her into the conversation, but trying to talk would only highlight her ignorance. At times like this, she felt the strain of having a foot in two worlds. Reuben belonged here, and she wanted to believe she belonged with Reuben, but that turned out to be no simple calculation. Across the room, the prince walked away from the human girl, leaving her standing alone as figures whirled around her. After a moment, she headed toward the dyes. The prince paused his retreat to watch her go with an expression Kay recognized. The look of someone who wondered if the other person might be made of glamour and smoke, if they might fade away at a touch. Reuben had looked at her that way. Then the prince went to a table where he lifted a pitcher of wine to his mouth, not bothering with a glass, tipping the vessel back until the dark liquid streamed over his chin. Kai wandered toward him on impulse with some idea that if he was guzzling wine, he wouldn't be that hard to draw into conversation. After all, if Reuben was going to pledge fealty to this guy's brother, she'd better get to know the family. "You're Prince Carden," Kay said, with what she hoped was a half-decent curtsy. Raven feathers covered the top of his doublet, gleaming in blues and purples like an oil slick. Up close she could see that he'd smeared his eye makeup. Putting down the pitcher and wiping off his chin with the back of his gloved hand, he narrowed his gaze. She wondered if he was going to order her to step back 10 paces. "My name is Kay, she told him, from the court of termites. She waved vaguely toward where Reuben and Dulcamara and all the others were standing, hoping that would give him pause, were he thinking of scolding her for talking to him. A sneer pulled up the corner of his mouth. "Ah, come to watch your fearsome lord Reuben bend a knee to my brother. Were I you, I would quit your king's court before you are made a part of this one." "I wouldn't expect to hear a prince say that," Kay said. "But then what do you know of princes?" he asked. "Fair enough," she said. Right then she wasn't sure she knew anything about anything. All around them, bells rang out, signaling that the coronation was to begin soon. The musicians stilled their playing, and only the hum of conversation filled the hall. An ogre, startled, knocked into the wood, sending a pile of pomegranates rolling down the wood. They knocked into plates of sweets and against the pitcher of wine, sending it careening off the table. Prince Carden caught the handle deftly, although she hadn't seen him so much as look in that direction. He smirked. "Care for a glass? If so, you'll have to find an actual glass." "Should I get Reuben to reconsider joining the High Court?" she asked. When Reuben was a young knight, he'd sworn himself into the service of the beautiful queen he loved. That had been a big mistake. If he was about to make another, Kay would like to prevent it if she could. "Could you?" Prince Carden returned, gaze heavy-lidded. She searched his face for some sign of whether to trust his judgment. An impossible task. "I doubt he'd thank you for the advice," he went on. "Kings are notoriously fickle. They ill reward that which stings their pride." "Bad kings, maybe," she said. Carden snorted as though she'd said something particularly amusing. He cut a pointed look toward Reuben. The Alder King's son had gone, and Reuben was talking to a woman from the undersea with dripping wet hair and pink gills that ran like 3 slashes just beneath her jawline. "Is he kind, then, your lord?" Kay rolled her eyes at him. Reuben's reputation wasn't for being kind. That much was true, but that didn't mean he wasn't. Maybe it was the same with Dane. Maybe Prince Carden didn't know anything. "Ruling is like wine," Carden said, lifting the pitcher. "It brings out the worst in anyone who takes too deep a draught. Yet we all want a taste." "Even you?" Kay asked. He looked away, his gaze going toward the dyes, and Kay realized he was looking at the girl, the mortal girl. "What I want," he said, "is for Dane never to get the throne. Failing that, I'd love to see the whole court of termites walk out of here without your kings pledging anything. But then it is my nature to only want things I cannot have. So tell me something, Kay said. If joining this court is so bad, tell me something I can take back to Reuben, something that will give him doubts. Cardan shook his head. What is there to say? First my brother will seem one way, and then another, and then, well, by then there will be no help possible. No help at all. But why would your king listen to either of us in preference to the newly anointed High King of Elfheim? He handed the pitcher of wine to her. Drown your cares. Tonight we dance through the leather of our shoes and celebrate my father's abandoning the rest of his children. Before she was able to come up with a response, he staggered into the crowd. Kay stared after him, unnerved. As she walked back to Reuben, Prince Cardan's last words echoed in her ears. Many times she'd wished that Reuben would just abdicate his throne, but she'd never considered how his people would feel. Abandoned. What if I told you not to swear to Prince Dane? Kai asked, hooking her hand in his. His long fingers were cool to the touch as he raised her palm to his lips. His eyebrows went up. Then I won't, he said after a moment, simply and a little terrifyingly. She wanted him to trust her, of course, but she wasn't sure she deserved that much trust. Is there a particular reason? He went on. I have a bad feeling, she said, hoping she wasn't making a huge mistake. It'll make things a touch awkward, he said after a moment. We would be well served to leave the Isles tonight before the newly anointed High King Dane attempts to force the matter. Which meant, she guessed, that not swearing fealty was going to be really, really bad. Like, maybe an act of war bad. But before she could ask, King Eldred began to speak. Kay realized Cardan wasn't on the stage with the rest of his family. Had he left the court after all? Kay hoped so, for his sake. When this is over, I want to come back to Faerie, she whispered. With you. He narrowed his eyes at her. Whatsoever do you mean? Around them, the folk called out the words to acknowledge High King Eldred's abdicating his throne, but Kay had realized Reuben was never going to do that, and probably shouldn't. Unless she wanted them to live on the edges of each other's lives, she was going to have to change. I could give the coffee shop to Corny and Lewis and live in the Palace of Termites, she said. I want to help you with your job. Now that she'd come to a decision, Kai felt embarrassed. He might not expect her to be all that helpful. She was occasionally clever, but Kay often had the sinking feeling that she used her cleverness to get away with being lazy. Also, she wasn't sure if calling ruling a kingdom a job was insulting or not. Also, she might have just talked him into war. She grew even more embarrassed at the way he stared. He seemed utterly thrown. Finally, after an overlong silence, he said, I love you too well for that. So it's good enough for you, but not for me. She put her hands on her hips. And I'm supposed to, what? Be happy when I know you're not? Be happy enough for both of us? He looked as though he were about to say something, but then swallowed the words. On the dais, a representative from the Unseelie courts was drawing swirls over Prince Dane's skin with blood to prepare him for the coronation. Reuben probably wanted Kai to just shut up and pretend to be interested in what was happening, but she was feeling pettish and rejected and couldn't seem to stop talking. Happiness isn't something to carefully measure out in spoonfuls as though it's medicine, she said. I don't need you to suffer to prove your love, and I definitely don't need you to hide your suffering. I want to shoulder half our burden. Love shouldn't mean shouldering what has naught to do with you, he said. But it does, she said. That is what it means. That's exactly what it means. You will tire of it, he spat, real anger in his voice. You will tire of it, and you will tire of me. She stepped back, dropping his hand, and they stared at each other for a long moment, too shocked to speak. Many times Kay had wondered over his loving her. She hadn't guessed he had doubts about her, too. How could he, when he was the Unseelie king, born into the gentry, a tortured and famous knight of Faerie? When he came into Moon in a cup, conversation grew hushed. Laughter ceased, and after he left, customers talked about how much they wanted to bone him. I drink a lot of coffee, she said, trying for lightness. My motto is, never tired. Fairy is a deadly place, as you well know, he returned, grim, and she felt certain her joke had been a misstep, replete with horror and cruelty and caprice. But even knowing that, you still cannot know what it is for it to occupy the whole of your days and all your nights. I've been in Fairy lots of times, Kay said. It's not all bad. And the Court of Termites is different now that you're in charge. You've changed it. Just then, the hall seemed to inhale as one. Someone screamed. Kay turned back to the dais in time to see one of the princes had his sword out. She couldn't remember his name, but the one who wasn't Cardan and wasn't Dane was threatening the others. A moment later, his blade pierced Elowin's throat. The princess went to her knees, everything drenched in blood. The blood poured from her throat the way the wine had poured from Cardan's pitcher. Dulcamara grimaced. Even Reuben flinched. Why did he do that? Kay demanded. Maybe she really should have been paying better attention. That's not part of the ceremony, is it? Perhaps you'd like to expound on your earlier point, Reuben drawled, his hand going to the hilt of his sword, about how Fairy is not all bad. You're seriously not going for the I told you so right now, are you? Kay demanded. His eyes were on the violence and his voice was very dry. Admit I've won this argument. But then it became clear that the royal guard was in on the scheme and Reuben wanted to go up there himself and do something. Dulcamara and several of his other knights had to scold him back as the rest of the royal family was slaughtered, one by one. Screaming filled the hall. Kay looked around for the youngest prince, but he was nowhere to be seen. Let me go, Reuben was saying to Dulcamara. I order you. You can't cut through the whole guard, she said, interrupting him before he could finish the sentence. Don't be a fool. On the dais, Baelkin was engaged in a lot of yelling about the crown, which turned out to be cursed. Of course, Kay said, to no one in particular, feeling a little nauseated. Of course it's cursed. She was starting to think all crowns were. It's like one of those shows where people move to another country for love. That was what Louis had told her about a week and a half later when she was packing up her stuff and giving Corny the keys to Moon in a cup. He'd started it with her after all, and Val was going to help him run it, along with Ravis, her troll boyfriend, who concocted a goodly percentage of the potions they sold. Louis, out of medical school and done with his residency, was busy being a doctor. There's a young beau who roasts her own beans in Brooklyn, Kay told them. Delicious, but she's in high demand and fickle about availability. For backup beans, there's a family just outside Newark. Mortal, they've got a whole setup in their garage. I know, Corny said, for what he clearly felt was the millionth time. And for pastries, there's no one better than that Bucka up north in Kingston. His garden is full of flowers, and he adds charmed glazes according to his whims. Kay went on. Mostly they're fun, but occasionally they're a bit alarming. Yes, Corny said. We know what we're doing. Go be the lady of the manor. We're fine. She told them about her resources for fairy fruit pastries. She reminded them about the little iron ball glued to the edge of the wooden counter to touch money against before putting it in the register to make sure it wasn't glamored leaves. You're not going that far away, Corny said. We'll see you all the time. You're even going to have your phone with you. I'll text you, I promise. Reception is terrible under the hill, she reminded him. But he just gave her a look because, of course, she wasn't trapped there. She could go outside and get his text. If something went wrong, she could come back. She had wings. She could fly back. Besides, he didn't really need her. And with no more excuses, Kai gave them all hugs and said her goodbyes. Then she took her garbage bags of clothes and her cardboard box of novelty mugs and she started in the direction of the train station. It's like one of those shows where people move to another country for love. Kai thought, except in this one, he hasn't asked me to come. Reuben wasn't in his rooms when she arrived under the hill in the Court of Termites. She barged in anyway, sending servants into fits. She was allowed to be there, of course, to stretch out on his tapestry bed covers, sit for as long as she liked in his sinister chairs, and order anything she desired from the kitchens. But she did not usually start putting stuff away in the armorer, or redecorating. Paige came in, pale as paper, wearing brown livery and sporting a pair of tiny goat horns. "My lady," the page said, "may I offer you some assistance?" "Oh yes," Kay said. "I have something for you to send to the new High King of Elfheim." Prince Cardan had turned up after all. As one of his vassals, she was pretty sure she owed him a present now and again. Besides, she'd found the perfect thing. "Yes, but," the page began. Reaching into the box, Kai took out a paper and twine wrapped package and handed it over. "And you can tell Reuben I'm staying." With a nervous bow and a wince at her not using Reuben's title, the goat-haired fairy went out. Not too long after, the Termite King himself arrived, clad in flat black with shoulder plates that resembled the carapaces of beetles. She wore a look of someone caught between surprise and suspicion. "And just what do you suppose you are doing?" he asked, taking in the clothes, the chibi sushi throw pillow Kay had arranged on one chair, the dumpster salvage painting she'd propped against a wall. His voice had a chill in it. "I told you I was coming to Fairy." She hoped she didn't sound as nervous as she felt. "Thought I made my point at the coronation," he said. "In fact, never has a point been made so quickly supported by fate." "Yes, fine, you made your point," Kay said. "You won the argument. Fairy is dangerous. But I know you better than you think, and I am tougher than you think, and I am not going to get rid of you. Maybe of all the rest of Fairy sometimes, but never of you." "And if I do not want you here?" he said, voice still cold. She took a deep breath and deployed the only weapon at her disposal. "Then you must tell me to go. Tell me that you don't want me. Say you don't want me here, and I'll go." He stared at her intently for a long moment. Finally, he slumped down in the chair with the sushi pillow. A smile pulled at his mouth, and it was one of those rare moments when he seemed very young. "Since I cannot lie," Reuben said, "I suppose you must stay." Sometime later, the boy who had once been Prince Cardan lounged on the throne of Elfheim. A page from one of the lower courts came in with a package, setting it before him and bowing deeply. Cardan stared at the brown paper wrapping, sealed with the waxen stamp of the Court of Termites. He opened it with trepidation. There in his long fingers was a black coffee mug of the sort that mortals used. He spun it in his hands until he saw the writing on one side. "I rule," it read. High King Cardan gazed upon the message with great bafflement, and then, after a moment, his mouth lifted with the beginnings of a smile. "I suppose that I do," he said to himself, holding out the cup to be filled with wine. "But what sort of ruler will I be?" Okay, guys, so that's the end of the short story in the back of the Cruel Prince book. And for some reason, I can't for the life of me remember the title of it. But that's the end of it, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like videos like this, I have more on my channel. If you are interested in what else I have on my channel, it's mostly fashion. It's mostly fashion videos right now, cats, and books at the moment. So if you're interested in fashion, cats, and books, then stick around. I can't guarantee that I'll ever get a consistent recording or consistent uploading schedule. I cannot guarantee that. But if you're interested in any more stuff like this, then look around. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you did not like this video, then that's too bad, I guess. I don't know how you made it to the end if you didn't like it, but alright. And I hope that you have a good day or night.